Hello and welcome. I'll be starting off this project right at the beginning. The Bible is a collection of books that were written by a whole bunch of different people through a long period of time. There are books, letters, there's poetry, all sorts of things, and they were compiled into one book that we know of now as the Bible. The very first book in the collection is called Genesis. Genesis actually comes from the Greek language, but the original text was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew people called it "in the beginning." So it's an appropriate place to start. When we jump into the book, we have an account of creation, God creating the world. And the big question always comes up right away: was this a metaphor? Was it a myth? Was it meant to be fact or history? Did God really create the world in 7 literal days? Was it 7 eras? Or is the whole thing just a myth to say something different? I would say, personally, that we're asking the wrong questions. The book was written by Middle Eastern people a long time ago, and we're reading it as modern, Enlightenment-driven Western people who are much more influenced by Greek thinking. And the original writer and the original audience would not have thought the same way about this book, about what they were writing. So for now, I'm going to talk about Moses as the author. The traditional view is that Moses wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible, and that would include Genesis. So for simplicity, I'm just going to talk about Moses here, and we can get into issues of did Moses write the book or not later on. But for now, let's assume he did. He was coming out of Egypt, leading a bunch of Hebrew people who had been slaves for 400 years. And these people knew the history of their family line, and they knew the God of their fathers. At least they knew about God. But what they really saw was the Egyptian gods at work. And in Egypt, the gods, plural, had lots of different jobs. There were gods for all sorts of different things. And they didn't really know that much about the God of their fathers. And so Moses was writing this stuff down. And as he did, he was explaining to these people who God is. And what better way to start a whole series of books about who God is than with a liturgical poem? Genesis 1 has all the elements of Hebrew poetry. There's repetition, all sorts of different literary devices, and it was meant to be a poem showing us who God is. So was this meant to show us that this was a literal 7-day creation? Was it meant to give us a scientific account? It's like, no, not at all. Doesn't mean it wasn't 7 literal days, but you can't read a poem and build doctrine out of it. So what do we do with that? Well, we try to look at it the way the original readers would have, which is to see what it says about God and about creation. So I'm going to leave, or at least put aside for a while, the scientific debates about creation, evolution, science, faith, all that. It's important. They're important things to consider, but for now, just not going to go there quite yet. Instead, I want to look at Genesis and the creation account from a slightly different perspective. This is where God is giving us, as readers, a picture of what God wanted life to look like. So it's not about how he accomplished it. It's about God himself and what life was supposed to be for humans. And so God created everything, and the very last thing that the Bible says he created was Adam, a human being, the first man. And he did this by sculpting dirt, right? And God is an artist. In this case, he was sculpting, and he got dirt and formed it into this shape of a human being, and it was still a lump of dirt. And women, when you say men are dirt, technically, theologically, you're right. And God took this dirt and he breathed his breath. The breath of God entered this lump of dirt, and Adam became a living human being. And so the first element of life is the breath of God. Without it, we're just a lump of dirt. Well, when you look at the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, you really get a sense that Adam had a very intimate relationship with God. And even the account of the fall, I was always taught that God can't be in the presence of a sinful human being. But Adam and Eve sinned, and there was God showing up and talking to them face to face, just like he always did. He was walking through the garden, saw Adam and Eve, they were naked, and they were ashamed because they were naked. It was the first time they realized they were naked, and they were hiding. They covered themselves with fig leaves. And my father-in-law had a fig tree, and found out that fig leaves can be really scratchy and itchy, and they covered their privates with them. And God was looking at them saying, this is not what I designed. And they had a conversation, though. There was a level of intimacy with God that we see in Genesis 3. And Adam had that. He would talk to God, and everything was great. Now, from what I've been taught as a Western-thinking Christian, I always just sort of assumed that that was the goal of life. The ultimate fulfillment of life, the ultimate thing that could make us whole and complete, was to be face-to-face in an intimate relationship with God. And Adam had that. It was a perfect, sinless world. Adam was face-to-face with God. Who could want anything more than that? And God said, for the first time we have recorded, this is not good. It's shocking to me when I first saw that. God said, this is not good. This is not what I designed. And he said specifically, it's not good for man to be alone. So Adam, face to face in a sinless world, face to face with God, having an intimate friendship with God, God said, this is not good. He's alone. And so God created Eve, and he brought them together, and he told them to have children. And those children would have children, and they would have children. And what we end up with is a whole community of people together with each other and with God. It's not just me and God. And many of us go into church and we close our eyes and raise our hands and sing, it's me and you, God. And God is saying, that's not what I designed. It's us and God. Without that human community, we can't be whole and complete. Well, another thing surprised me. God gave Adam and Eve work to do, but work was supposed to be fulfilling. And we think of work as a sort of drudgery, right? We dread Monday mornings, but for Adam and Eve, this work completed them. It helped make them whole. It helped make life what God wanted it to look like. And then another thing that surprised me, because I come from the West in a very Greek-influenced, philosophically Greek mindset, the Greeks tended to separate the physical world and the spiritual world. And here we are in the physical world, and here's the spiritual world, and the two sort of are, at odds with one another. But in Hebrew thinking, and even today in the Middle East, the thinking there is that the physical world and the spiritual world are joined so tightly that you can't separate them. And that's why when we get later into what the Jewish people call the Torah, the law, the first 5 books, we get farther into that, there is actually a law, a commandment that you have to go to the bathroom a certain way. And when you say that to Western thinking people, you usually get a little chuckle out of that. Like, wait, God cares how is he watching us when we're going to the bathroom? It's kind of weird to think about that. But yeah, there's a law in the Torah about how to do a number 2. And it's because the physical world and our physical bodies are so tightly married to the spiritual that how we use the bathroom is part of how we live out our faith in God. And so these two things are inseparable, and God created the physical world and called it good. And specifically, the Bible tells us that God created trees not just to take in bad stuff out of the air and produce good stuff and keep us alive. We've learned that trees do that. But the Bible says God created trees for 2 things: to be pleasing to the eye and to be good for food. God didn't want us eating rice cakes. He made trees to produce fruit that we would enjoy. He wanted us to enjoy this physical world. And he also made the trees to be pleasing to the eye. And I looked up the word in Hebrew for pleasing. It's pleasure, and it's a very strong word. It's not pretty, right? He didn't make the trees just to be pretty. He made the trees to be beautiful. And here's how I'm using that word. Beauty, in this sense, is pleasure for the eyes, which is what God created here. He wanted trees that were pleasing to the eyes. They gave pleasure to the eyes. And the word pleasure, it's not just pretty. It's a really deep, strong word. It's something that affects us inside. And we have pleasure, right? God has told Adam and Eve to become one flesh, to be as intimate as two people can be. And when we do that, we have extreme pleasure. God created this pleasure. God created the ability to covet. In fact, one of the commandments is, you shall not covet. Do not covet. And the word for covet is the same word in Hebrew as the word pleasure here. So God created something in the Garden of Eden that could be used for good or for evil. It could be used in a pure sense or misused in a sinful sense. And he put that right there in the Garden of Eden. And it's a type of beauty that can change us for good or for evil. And God so badly wanted us to experience pleasure that he took the risk of that pleasure being misused. And we'll see that happen later on. But meanwhile, just want to review these 5 things that God created and wants us to enjoy. This is what God designed for us. The breath of God, then intimacy with God. There's community that we enjoy with one another. There's work that fulfills us. And there's the physical world that gives us good things and it gives us pleasure. And this is how God wanted us to experience life. And then Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit. Here comes this serpent. Later in the Bible, we find out that the serpent is the devil. But this serpent comes along and he's trying to tempt Adam and Eve. All right, why is he doing that? We'll get to that sooner or later. But for now, the devil is trying to tempt Adam and Eve to disobey God. And he says, did God really hold out on you? Did God say there is a tree that you can't eat from? Well, sure enough, God had told Adam, you can eat from any tree in this entire garden except that one. And look at the apples, look at the oranges on these trees. There are grapes, there's a grapevine over here, the grapes are huge. You can eat any of this. And of course, Adam said, why not that one? And God said, well, just don't worry about why not. Just, you can have any of this other fruit from any other tree. And Adam said, can I walk around that tree? And God said, yeah, you can walk around the tree. And then Adam said, well, can I climb the tree? God said, sure, you can climb the tree, but don't eat the fruit. You can eat any other fruit. And Adam said, can I smell the fruit? And God said, you can smell the fruit, but don't eat it. Can I touch the fruit? And God said, look, Adam, just come over here. Don't go near the tree. Don't look at the tree. Don't smell the tree. Just go over here. And that's probably not exactly what happened, but as a parent of 4 children, I suspect it might be. But the other thing that may have happened is Eve, when Adam told her about the tree and showed it to her, she was fascinated as well. And they kind of made this little extra rule that you're not supposed to touch it, right? If you don't touch it, then you're certainly not going to eat it. So they made this extra rule to help them to not break the law, the one commandment that God gave them. And of course, didn't go so well. So the devil says to Eve, did God really tell you that there's something, a tree you can't eat from? And Eve said, well, that one over there, yeah, I mean, God said that we can't eat that fruit or touch it. Right? She added to the command that God gave. And you'd think maybe if Adam were there, he probably would have corrected her. But no, he's actually standing right next to her the whole time. And so the devil tempted Eve and said, just eat the fruit. God knows that it's so good and it's going to make you like God. And he's holding out on you. And Eve believed this serpent. She took the fruit and ate it, handed some to her husband. He was standing right there the whole time, and he took a bite. And they realized they were naked. And then they went and hid themselves because they were ashamed. They were naked. And then here comes God in the afternoon breeze, and he's walking around, and he's looking for them, and he calls out to them, and they kind of reluctantly come out from hiding, and they're wrapped up in their fig leaves and scratching themselves. And God's looking, and he says, did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat? Right? Now, he's not asking them because he doesn't know the answer. He's asking them like a parent of a child who sees a trail of cookie crumbs across the floor to behind the couch, and he goes, and there's the child with a mouthful of something. Did you eat the cookies that I told you not to eat? Mm-mm. And that's really what the scene, that's what's going on here. And Adam steps up first and he says, well, God, yes, I did eat the fruit that you told me not to eat, but it's her fault. That woman, and this is what he says, that woman, right, she made me do it. And reading into this, that woman that you gave me, she convinced me to do it. In other words, yes, I disobeyed you, God, but it's not my fault. That woman who you gave me, ultimately, this is your fault, God. I was happy sitting on the couch watching hockey with you, and now look what happened, right? This is your fault. But God then said to Eve, is this true? Did you do this? And Eve said, well, yes, but the serpent, he made me do it. And there's the serpent, and God starts talking with all three of them and pronounces the curse. And when we read about a curse in the Bible, if it's the curse, this is the curse that's being referred to. And God says, because you've done this, nothing is going to be the same. And there are a handful of things that happen here. First, God had already told Adam, if you eat the fruit from that tree, you will die. And the Hebrew is literally die the death. And even if he didn't know what die meant, die the death just sounds bad. You don't want it. And he knew this. So you will die. And the big question comes up, well, Adam ate the fruit and he's still alive. In fact, he lived, according to the scripture, he lived to be well into his 900s, which is a pretty good lifespan. So did he eat the fruit and not die? And the answer I was always given was, well, he died a spiritual death. When he ate the fruit, his spirit died. But no, he died. He literally, physically died. And again, this is us in the West, in our Western mindset, trying to reconcile Eastern thinking and Western thinking. We have to kind of spiritualize things because Adam didn't just fall over dead. But the point here is not that Adam would have taken the fruit and bit it and just dropped over. Like, God didn't lace the fruit with arsenic or something. There was no cyanide inside this fruit. And in fact, the fruit was good. But did Adam die? Yeah, he's not around anymore. Right? It took him a while, but eventually he died. A physical death. That's not what God intended. So with this disobedience came death. And the New Testament later on tells us that when sin entered the world, death entered the world with it. Not instantaneous death as soon as he bit, but death nonetheless. And we really need to embrace this idea of Middle Eastern thinking where you don't separate the spirit and the flesh, the spirit and the physical. Did Adam die? Yes, he died. And when you die, your body falls over. The breath of God left Adam's body. And when you die, eventually your body decomposes. You very literally turn back to dirt. And that's what happened. That's what God told him would happen. And that's eventually what ended up happening. Right? So Adam dies. Sooner or later, he dies. The breath of God left him. Another part of the curse was this. God said to Adam, because you've done this, your food will come at the sweat of your brow, which means two things. First thing, it means that the physical world is not going to be flourishing the way God wanted it to be. God didn't design the world to have all these storms and earthquakes and all these natural disasters. Everything was good. But the Bible, even in Romans in the New Testament, the Bible tells us that all of creation groans because of sin in the world. And so the physical world won't produce what it's supposed to. The pleasure that you're supposed to get from the physical world is being destroyed. And soon after this, instead of Adam and Eve coming together as a man and woman, husband and wife, we'll see a man with two wives, and wives begin to become looked at as property and lesser in value. And that's not what God intended at all either. And then later on still we see prostitution and all sorts of things where this pleasure that God created to be so good ends up being something destructive. So all these things are happening. To Eve, God said that you'll bear children with much more pain. I'll increase the pain in your childbearing. And that sort of implies there was pain before, which is a strange thought. And but I'll increase the pain. The physical world will cause suffering instead of pleasure. And we have the physical world falling apart, work becoming tedious. We dread work on Monday morning because of this. It's no longer fulfilling, but it's tedious. And then Adam and Eve, when they were together in perfection, it was absolutely amazing. But the moment God confronted Adam and Adam said, yes, I disobeyed you, right? We're going to face your judgment. And yes, I did this thing, but it's her fault. I blame her, and ultimately you, but it was her fault that I did this. Release your wrath on her, not me. And can you imagine Eve's face when he did that, as soon as he looked and pointed at her? And I guarantee you, the perfect trust in the perfect marriage relationship was destroyed. You can't recover from that. And, their relationship, not that it was horrible, but I'm sure it was never, ever the same. And every day they would remember what it was like before the fall, and they would long for it, and they can't have it. And finally, there's a real quick passage here. Well, first let me talk about this progression of sin. Adam and Eve sinned, God confronted them, and they said, yes, I did this, but it's someone else's fault. The next generation, Adam and Eve had two children, two sons that are mentioned. They had Cain and Abel. And Cain ended up desiring to kill Abel. And God came to him and warned him. But he did it anyway. And when God came and confronted Cain after the murder, God said, hey, where's your brother Abel? And Cain said, how am I supposed to know? Right? Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he is. So Adam and Eve said, yes, I sinned, but it's someone else's fault. Cain said, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything. Well, some time goes by, and the Bible introduces us then in chapter 4 of Genesis to a man named Lamech. And Lamech is the one who had two wives, and somebody insulted him, and he came home and bragged to his two wives that he killed the man who insulted him. And he's bragging about it. And much more we could say there, but the point is, we went from, yes, I sinned, but it's someone else's fault, to, I don't know what you're talking about, to, yeah, I sinned, and I'm proud of it. I'll benefit from this. This is a good thing. Sin is a good thing. And that's the progression that was taken in the Bible. And as this progression took place, there's this one little minute sentence that we usually gloss over, saying at that time, man began to call upon the name of the Lord. And I used to read that and think, well, finally, they're getting themselves straightened out a little bit. They're praying. That's wonderful. But that's not actually what it means. Adam and Eve were face to face in the most intimate relationship with God that you can have. Then they sinned, and God still showed up face to face and confronted them. Cain murdered his brother, and God showed up face to face and confronted him. By the time of Lamech, there's no mention of God. God didn't show up face to face, and he's not even mentioned at all. And then, after this, man began to call upon the name of the Lord, not because they're finally turning themselves around, but because they no longer have the intimacy that God wanted them to have. That intimacy with God is gone. All they can do now is call upon his name and hope that maybe he'll respond. And so we've had work in the physical world and relationships and community all being destroyed. We've had intimacy with God destroyed, and the very breath of God that gave us life in the first place leaves our physical bodies, and we turn back into dust, back to dirt. Everything that God wanted for us to experience pleasure is gone. It's destroyed. And at this point, this sort of sets the foundation for the whole rest of the Bible, because really one of the main things the Bible does from this point on is show us how God is going to restore everything to what it's supposed to be. And we'll keep going on that journey in future podcasts here. So thank you very much for your time. I hope to see you back again.